Right, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us. We will give it a few minutes. I can see participants joining us and you're all welcome. So let's just give it a few minutes and we will kickstart our webinar for today. So while we wait for others to join us, we would like to know where you're joining us from. So if you could just drop your name with your location in the chat box, that will be welcome. Thank you. So just a reminder for you to drop your name in the chat box and let us know where you're joining us from. It could be your institution or the country from which you are joining us from. We'll be happy to know where you're from. So once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. If you are in a place like I am, Australia, it is good evening. And welcome to this webinar, which has been organized to celebrate International Youth Day. So a very happy International Youth Day to all of you. And our webinar today is organized under the theme, Bolstering Youth Resilience and Their Voices in Climate Action. So a very important topic, and I'm really happy to see all of you on this call. So my name is Nalishevo Mebelo, and I work for ABT Global. I am the Africa lead for the Comprehensive Action for Climate Change Initiative. It is a USAID initiative, and some of you may probably have come across the acronym CACCI. So the Comprehensive Action for Climate Change Initiative is also called CACCI, and I am the Africa lead. So very pleased today to moderate this really important webinar. And before I do that, it will be important for me to actually share with you some insights into what CACCI really is. So CACCI is a leader with associate cooperative agreement designed, I said earlier on, under the auspices of USAID for USAID missions in partnership with country governments to provide a range of services to meet partner governments' specific needs on their journey towards meeting their commitments under the Paris Agreement on climate change. CACCI also contributes to USAID's climate strategy by helping countries to implement their NDCs, nationally determined contributions, and their NAPs, their National Adaptation Plans, while ensuring inclusion and local ownership of solutions and their benefits. So in terms of the objectives of CACCI, CACCI seeks to provide timely support to policy processes, to build the capacity of key policy institutions in countries, and to improve engagement and communication in the context of countries achieving their Paris Agreement commitments. Now, in line with today's webinar, CACCI is also dedicated to issues around gender equality and social inclusion in terms of expanding the participation and leadership of women, of youth, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, the elderly, and other historically excluded groups in the climate processes. CACCI also seeks to increase the access of women, youth, and other groups to finance that supports adaptation and mitigation, and also to strengthen and provide equitable access to robust gender-differentiated data to support evidence-based climate policy making, planning, and implementation. So CASI has been implemented since 2020, well, was launched in 2021 at COP26, and is still being implemented to date to support countries implement their NDCs and NAPs effectively. So moving on, ladies and gentlemen, we have today a panel of distinguished experts and practitioners who will be speaking to the issue of youth resilience and their participation in the climate change agenda. We are told that young people are already experiencing the effects of climate change directly and indirectly across many facets of life. And so colleagues who are on the panel today have been working within the youth and climate change space, and I will be introducing them so that you are familiar with them as they begin to provide their insights into what I think is an important topic for ourselves, our young people, and posterity. So I will begin by introducing colleague Hilary Hambrick-Taft, who is USAID's technical specialist for youth issues in the Inclusive Development Hub. She has over 12 years experience, and she began her career working in Guatemala as an educator at a community-led development center. And upon return to the US, Hilary worked with the Nashville, Tennessee Mayor's Office to launch the city's first summer youth employment program. And before joining USAID, she worked at Ashoka, supporting social entrepreneurs and country office business development. She's currently the co-chair of the Youth in Development Working Group of SID US. Hilary has an MA in International Development Studies and from GWU's Elliott School of International Affairs, and a BA in International Business from Belmont University. And I welcome you, Hilary, to this panel. We also have on the panel Joyce Mendes, who is a migrant, social entrepreneur, and climate advocate focused on the nexus of water, food, and energy justice. Joyce co-founded several local and regional youth organizations, including the Moema Vieza Environmental Education Observatory, the Latin American Observatory of Geopolitics of Energy, and the Binational Youth Collective of the Parana Basin 3 from the Cultivating Good Water initiative. So I welcome you, Joyce Mendes, with your huge background on this topic to this panel. I also welcome our third panelist, Hannah Girardo, who is the Gender and Youth Associate for the NDC Partnership. Some of you may be familiar with the NDC Partnership. She works to support countries in advancing gender equality and meaningful youth engagement through the NDC process. Her work focuses on driving support through progress on the partnership's gender strategy and youth engagement plan. Before joining the NDC Partnership, Hannah worked as an energy and gender specialist at Sustainable Energy for All, supporting energy access and gender initiatives to achieve Sustainable Development Goal number 7. So Hannah is a good choice for this panel today as we celebrate International Youth Day. And our final panelist is Tim Kerr. He is the Gender Equity, Disability, Social Inclusion and Governance Lead with the Australian Government Partnerships for Improving Education Program. This is an 8-year investment with the government of Papua New Guinea to improve the delivery of and access to quality education. Tim has over 16 years of working across public and non-profit sectors in various teaching, advisory, and leadership roles within New Zealand, East Africa, and the Pacific, strengthening education systems, policy, and governance, I beg your pardon. So his experience on this panel will be very useful to this discussion. So I want to welcome my panelists and thank you for finding time to be part of what I think is a very important conversation. So moving on, ladies and gentlemen, and welcoming those who have continued to join us in the audience. We request you to place your questions and comments in the chat box, which will be managed by colleagues who are working behind the scenes to ensure that we bring them to the attention of those to whom they are directed. We will continue to monitor your questions and answers. So having given that preamble, I will proceed to engage my panelists, and I hope my panelists are ready. I have given you a background of who they are. So obviously, these are people who are listening to our conversation. I would be interested actually in also finding out how many young people have actually joined us on this in this webinar, because this is really a conversation that affects you as young people. We would like to hear more and more from you as we delve into this discussion. So let me turn to you, Hilary, for the first question. It is said that climate-related issues confront all of us. We have also heard that these issues disproportionately impact populations in the global south, and our young people in particular. While it is important to raise awareness about the impacts of climate change on populations and groups such as, of course, the young, why is it important to frame these discussions and to advance initiatives that center the youth as change agents in climate action? And so the key word here is youth as change agents in climate action. So Hilary, over to you, and in 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shavo. Thank you everyone who's joined us. I just want to start by saying Happy International Youth Day. This is a wonderful day on August 12th to come together and to really celebrate the innovation and the power of young people. I'm here representing USAID. And so I just want to share a little bit about our work in the youth space. 2 years ago, we launched an updated youth and development policy. And that policy really outlines a vision of working with young people, generally ages 10 to 29, to have the agency, rights, and influence, as well as the opportunities to pursue their own life goals and contribute to the development of their communities. And so exactly to this point that you raised of young people being a great population in the global south, as well as the impacts of climate change impacting many in the global south, there's a natural overlay. As part of USAID's approach to youth development, we employ a framework and a methodology called positive youth development, or PYD. This is the framework that the entirety of the US government uses, but USAID is really leading at the forefront for applying this approach in international context. So PYD is evidence-based, and it's also cross-sectoral. So it really fits well with a lot of the climate action work that young people are doing around the globe, as well as USAID's investments, because it is cross-sectoral. At the heart of positive youth development, it is really about moving away from viewing young people as problems to be solved, but rather recognizing that young people have the solutions within them, as taking an assets-based approach to working with youth. So PYD also is a very holistic approach. It engages youth alongside their families, their communities, and their governments, so that young people are able to reach their full potential. And we also take a systems-based approach. So the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because when you think about holistic approaches, systems-based approaches, this is really how we view a lot of the climate action work that USAID takes. We do have a lot of resources around PYD. I know I just mentioned that, so I wanted to drop in the chat a link to one of our websites called Youth Power. And you can, hopefully I can drop the chat in, there it goes. So feel free to check that out. There's a ton of resources on PYD, toolkits, lots of great content, if that's something that you're interested in learning more about. But when we put positive youth development into practice, really it brings this point about young people as change agents. They are the center of everything that we're doing. So they're the center of development, including climate action. And we know that young people are not bystanders in the global impacts of climate change. They're already the decision makers of today and of tomorrow. Climate change and its many impacts are really going to have heightened consequences for youth. And often the youth that we work with are members of other marginalized or underrepresented groups, such as thinking of Indigenous youth, of adolescent girls, LGBTQI plus youth, and youth with disabilities. One example of a way that young people are at the forefront of combating climate change and promoting climate action is an organization called Youth Mappers, a program called Youth Mappers that's supported by USAID's Geo Center. And that Youth Mappers program works with university students in over 400 institutions in 75 countries. And they train university students how to use geomapping tools to analyze different geographic data and identify solutions to pressing development issues as well as issues related to climate change. And the reason I wanted to share this example is because those students at those local universities really are the best positioned to be able to address the consequences of climate change because they are from those communities that are most affected. I'll also share quickly a video from one of the projects in Tanzania. When I was preparing for today, I got really excited seeing this video, so you all can watch it another time. But it is from young people who are working in coastal communities in Tanzania, and the way that they've been able to map the mangroves and the erosion of the mangroves and where they needed to plant more in order to prevent erosion of the island. So anyways, a really interesting example of how they're using mapping skills to be able to combat climate change. And just to close, there's other examples from Colombia that I'll share later, and some from Kenya that I'll talk about in a bit. But these are just great examples of how USAID is collaborating with young people who already have the expertise that they need to make positive change. USAID is just really coming along to provide additional access to software, in this case of the Geo Center, and resources and funding to be able to make a difference. So thanks for letting me share. Back to you, Shepo.
Thank you, Hilary. So young people are at the pinnacle of all that we do. I like that. And they're not bystanders. They must be seen as decision makers and located at the forefront of creating positive change. Thanks, Hilary. I'm really excited to hear what USAID is doing in terms of providing policy on supporting young people to have opportunities through holistic, cross-sectoral, and assistance-based approaches. So that is really exciting, and happy for you to have shared those links in the chat box, and I hope our audience has taken note of those. So moving on to you, Joyce, as an advocate of migration, of social inclusion, of climate. One of the adverse impacts of climate change is seen in the temporary and permanent migration and displacement within countries and across borders. It's noted that children and youth are heavily impacted by this. So it's also estimated that 1 out of every 8 migrants is a child. That statistic. So in your view, what should governments and funders prioritize regarding policy, funding, and action in this space? This is for you, Joyce.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Yes? Super. Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, well, basically it is especially very relevant to like recent news and also kind of protests that are taking place in some parts of the world about migration. Sometimes we tend, or as well media, we tend to see that is just a number, and we forget we're talking about humans. So I think especially when we where with climate change we realize that yeah, those numbers impact people's lives, and in migration, when we count and we see nowadays migration, but also, you know, with the impacts of climate change, we have data that says that the World Bank says that around 200 million people will be migrating within their own countries by 2050, and we could even have up to 50 million climate migrants by 2050 as well. So those are really worrying numbers in the way that, as I said, every number is associated to one person's lives, family, a destiny, and also kind of the dreams and the future of youth. And also, like, as a migrant, I always kind of try to analyze what taught me to climate action, and how when you migrate to a place, you have as well this hope to restart your life again, and to kind of to find this sense of security and safety, right? However, we see with climate change, obviously there is, we're going to see impacts, and we're seeing impacts all around the planet. And I think one of the most important things that I realize, personally, I think is just kind of making awareness about the importance of understanding what are the causes behind that migration, right? About the importance to mitigate hate speech as well, and fake news, because we realize that also migration is associated to many other social aspects besides climate. And I think that if we have these kind of parameters, those are going to be kind of the foundation to address respectfully public policies and international cooperation frameworks. Also, I believe that when we think, especially in climate change, we see migration as an additional situation. However, migration as well could be included inside the adaptation practices. So investment in adaptation is fundamental, right? So we can prepare the communities, we can prepare places to and learn to deal with climate change, and increase their resilience capacity. Um, and we see again that migration as well could be cyclical, and in a temporary basis. And we have realized that investments in adaptation really decrease, and long term as well, the cost associated to disasters, and to kind of the aftermath on climate effects. So I think that sometimes when we see about climate policies, we tend to see migration versus adaptation, and I think it has to be kind of an equal. You know, like we need to address it equally. Especially sometimes we focus too much on mitigation, right? But migration needs to be part of the climate adaptation frameworks. And yeah, that's kind of my perspective. It's not an easy question. I mean, we have seen that every country has a different way of handling, especially migration. But I think that nowadays that we're going to see increase of climate migrants, especially with kids and young people, other frameworks and other modus operandi need to be applied. Again, emphasizing that it's not just numbers, but those are people. So it's not enough to say, you know, like stop migration, but to really understand what is the systemic cause of it, and how we can also, as citizens, support this process. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So that was Joyce Mendes talking about migration. And what got me there was when you said data on migration should be seen in the context of the fact that it's about people. Migration is about people, and not it should not just be seen as a statistic. I think that was something that I have learned today, and that migration seeks a new and better life, and yet climate also poses a whole new challenge in the reasons why people actually migrate. And then you've also talked about the importance of balancing the focus on addressing mitigation and addressing migration, that, you know, there should be a balance in terms of how policies address those two issues, and it should not be skewed only towards mitigation. And then you are also saying that we need to increase awareness among migrants, people who migrate, you know, increase awareness about climate change, but also invest in adaptation that will assist in reducing migration as a result of climate issues. So thank you, Joyce. I think those were really, really important points, and I will be coming back to you to try and expand a little bit on that. So moving on to Hannah. Hannah, youth climate advocates from around the globe are more likely to be invited to large meetings such as the COP, as we have seen in recent years. However, we've also noted that these young people are not always part of their country delegations. They are not even part of the teams of negotiators. We know that young people want to be more meaningful, and they want to be engaged more and more in international events and at home and in their countries.
Yeah.
How are countries taking steps towards ensuring that the voices of young people translate into concrete policies and actions when in fact they are not seen at the big tables? So Hannah, this is for you.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be here with everyone today. I thought I'd answer your question, but kind of quickly go through the NDC partnership for those of you who aren't familiar with how we work on this call. So the NDC partnership is a global coalition bringing together more than 220 members, which includes over 120 countries, developed and developing, as well as 100 institutions, such as CASI, to deliver on ambitious transformational climate action that helps achieve the Paris Agreement and drive sustainable development. So this includes ongoing support to our country members for the implementation of their climate action. But in the coming year, especially, our collective membership support will be critical to bolstering countries to deliver on their NDC updates in 2025. And these NDCs, these documents, are critical, and we will need to see ambitious climate commitments to drive this transformational change, some of which we've already talked about today. Through these efforts, many countries are looking to increase inclusion in their commitment, in their development of this document, as well as how it is carried out over the next decade, many, many years. So thinking through kind of this context that we find ourselves in, the NDC partnership is actively working to support countries on this broader effort, but that includes specific efforts to increase youth engagement as well. But one of the core areas of our support is through the NDC 3.0 Navigator, which is a fairly new online tool developed with UNFCCC and supported by nearly 30 partners. That's intended to help countries identify opportunities to raise ambition in their NDCs 3.0, this kind of third round, specifically within their own context. So it's a non-exhaustive menu of options that is intended to enhance ambition and accelerate implementation. These include routes, they're called, to ensure kind of speaking to the youth engagement aspect in particular. These include routes to ensure a just transition, as well as work with all of society is kind of the term that we use most often, which is quite a broad brush. But when you really kind of look at what that means and drill down into all these different subgroupings of society, and what it takes to really engage them and work with them to develop these policy documents that are supportive of their needs and wishes as well. This tool will also be expanded over time as we learn more and as more guidance becomes available. And I'm just going to drop that link in the chat now so folks can take a look. But one example I think that is nicely featured in this tool comes from the country of Panama, which has taken great steps to engage young people through multiple efforts, including an academy for young leaders in the climate space that has been going on for many years, training opportunities, capacity building, as well as efforts to integrate young people into public service. So folks who graduate this climate academy are then brought into government, trying to kind of strengthen the sustainability of some of these efforts. Panama has also made commitments to bring young people to their international delegations, including COP, as negotiators. So speaking kind of more directly to your point about what this looks like on the international space and those seats at the table. This tool, not to say too much about it, but I think it's a really important kind of aggregate of so much work that's going on across the NDC partnership and so many organizations and different people in this space. But it includes a number of resources for countries or for young people working as stakeholders in their national processes. This is quite a long list. It's not comprehensive, but there's space to add more. Includes the UNDP developed checklist for decision makers on youth inclusive NDC processes. It includes the Youngo Youth Stocktake, many other resources and guidance documents that help just kind of guide folks that are interested in bolstering this work in their country. So I think to kind of take your question further, this is so important to see at an international level with seats at the table. I think countries are more and more bringing in diverse kind of delegations to these large events. But it's really, I think, to see the change that we need to see in the sustainability of these efforts, we need to have these national level processes and stakeholder engagement actions reflect the populations and reflect the people that will be most impacted by these policies. So just to close on this question, I know we've got lots we can talk about today. I wanted to mention that kind of with a similar goal, the NDC partnership hosts a youth engagement forum each year for all of our members. And this year we are working on regional workshops to sit with our country members, learn from each other around best practices for youth engagement, but looking at kind of this national level. And so far, participants have been very interested in learning more about how to do some of the stakeholder engagement work from their neighbors, including how to incorporate the voices of children under the age of 18, which I think can be a particular challenge, looking at young people in rural areas, places where an online kind of Wi-Fi access participation might not be as accessible. They've noted their intentions to include young people in their negotiating teams. They've looked at the importance of sector-specific goals as well, and commitments around sectors, especially looking at the workforce of a climate transition, what this would need. So NDCs are one aspect, one tool to accomplish these very large climate goals and really kind of societal transformational goals. But we also look at kind of long-term planning documents, LT-LEDs, adaptation plans, like was mentioned, financing and national level budgeting for these efforts. But also I think it's really important, as Joyce noted, to look at the social aspects such as migration and just transitions. These are all necessary components, and there's absolutely much more work to be done on this front and support that countries need, that some of which is being requested through the partnership, but I think there's a lot more that we can do together. So looking forward to this collaborative approach as we kind of continue the conversation today.
Good. Okay, so thank you very much, Hannah, for your intervention. Thanks for enlightening us on the work of the NDC partnership. That's a lot of work that you are doing, so thank you for sharing. And I'm happy to note that you have delved into supporting the youth. A point that I take away from you is that national level processes need to reflect the impacted, right? So in that case, our young people and other, marginalized groups need to be brought to the table in the processes of decision making and in the processes of negotiating. You also shared a tool, the Navigator, NDC 3.0 Navigator, and I've seen it in the chat box. So I implore on the audience to take note of the link to the NDC Navigator and familiarize. Thank you so much for also sharing the example of what is happening in Panama in terms of how the government of Panama is including young people at various levels, including getting them to work in the civil service. So that's interesting. And I will come back to you, Hannah. Let me move on to our next panelist before I am accused of not being sensitive to gender. So I'll move on to our colleague, Tim. Tim, every year, extreme climate events have devastating effects on the education of children and youth. These damage and destroy school infrastructure. And we are told that between 2000 and 2019, at least 60 major disasters across 30 countries disrupted education for 11 million children. Those are quite interesting statistics. There is a clear need to build resilience in school infrastructure and also among school staff and students. How can resilience be built in this domain, Tim? And how can you discuss what you do in this space through the Partnerships for Improving Education program? Over to you, Tim.
Hi, everyone. Some of you may have heard of the devastating landslides that affected communities in Enga province in Papua New Guinea in May this year. And, you know, Papua New Guinea, like many countries, we can no longer think of disasters as singular events. You know, more and more we're seeing, you know, disasters which are complex, cascading, protracted. And I think that's a useful starting point when thinking about and when talking about building resilience. And for those of you who are not familiar with Papua New Guinea, 80% of communities live in rural areas. 83% of communities have no connection to power grids. It's estimated that about 60% of the population are under 25. And you know, it's therefore really, really, really critical that that schools and communities, you know, are equipped to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. And one key intervention with Partnerships for Improving Education is around strengthening school governance. And this is around equipping school leaders, school boards of management, and school communities with knowledge around disaster risk management, you know, how they can prepare their schools and communities in that preparedness and that response and that recovery stage. And this also includes, you know, engaging youth in planning and decision making. So, for example, some examples at the preparedness stage, this might be, for example, around emergency drills. It might be around risk mapping, or, you know, schools developing certain sound alerts depending on the type of hazard event. It's around, you know, thinking about how do we make sure that infrastructure is resilient. This might be even simple things like fixing gutters. It might be, you know, digging trenches in anticipation of the flood waters that might come in. And it's also around mobilizing communities and you know, really leveraging the different resources and the different skill sets within a particular community. In terms of response, this is really thinking about you know, learning continuity by way of, for example, preparing home learning packs, thinking about emergency procedures, and then response, and that's, you know, recovery, and that's really around, you know, when it comes to infrastructure, that's around sort of regular maintenance checks to make sure that the type of infrastructure is resilient and flexible depending on any particular context. And this is really, really important because, as I mentioned, you know, schools are incredibly remote, and they are, you know, we know that they function as hubs for their communities, and really critical in supporting, you know, as first responders. Another important thing is around contextually appropriate initiatives. You know, we know that schools and their communities are experts of their lives and of their contexts. And so one of the initiatives through Partnerships for Improving Education is through a school grant. It's called a KIFA grant, and this is Achieving Quality Education for All. And this is really to provide schools an opportunity to develop, you know, school-led, locally led approaches to, you know, to preparedness, response, and recovery, among other things. And there's a real focus as well around, you know, intersectional approaches. We know that crises exacerbate existing inequalities. So really, it's an opportunity for schools to think about, how they might better ensure inclusion, be it through, thinking about WASH activities, thinking about access. So those are a few ways in which Partnerships for Improving Education is really working on building that and fostering that resilience. Thanks, Shiva.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tim. Yeah, I'm learning quite a lot from this webinar. And one of the things that I've learned is that, we tend to look at schools as just places where people go to learn. But Tim is telling us that schools function as hubs sometimes for and first responders during things like devastating effects of climate change. So there are times when you think schools are just there for people, education, but I think they are part of an ecosystem, and so they need to be seen as such. Thank you for sharing the example of Papua New Guinea and the devastating landslides there. And you also talked about the importance of ensuring that we have enough knowledge around disaster, that our communities have enough knowledge around disaster, our schools, our teachers have enough knowledge around disaster, and that our infrastructure is preserved, right? So thank you very much, Tim, for that intervention. We will move into a second round of questions, but I just want to ask my panelists to try and keep it short. And I'll go to one critical question that seems to be featuring in the climate change space. And it is a question around climate finance. I'll just hop onto that one, if you don't mind, colleagues. Climate finance is a topic that I believe, in the global south, is still quite an issue that requires capacity to be built. A lot of people need to understand what is around climate finance, around carbon markets, etc. But we know that funding is critical to the conversation on advancing climate resilience, and climate finance is a focal point in strategizing climate adaptation and mitigation. But many groups, especially our youth groups, are left out of opportunities for decision-making and discussion, and from receiving funding themselves. I mean, I attended a few meetings in the last few weeks on climate finance, and I didn't see young people in those meetings. So what I'm trying to say is, if young people are affected by climate change, why are they not part of the climate finance conversation? So in your view, and I'll start with you, Tim, what should donors, governments, and the private sector and other stakeholders do to ensure that young people and marginalized groups are part of the conversation around climate finance?
Thanks very much, Shibo. The first thing that comes to mind is around involvement of youth, not just within policies, but also in that policy development process. I think that's really critical. Acknowledging the important value add that they can bring to those discussions. Another thing is it's around thinking about what are the existing platforms for youth as well, and how to leverage those platforms. I think another possible idea is around investment in youth organizations as well. Those are a few initial ideas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Joyce, would you have anything to add to this topic on climate finance and young people?
Yeah, I think that also it is fundamental capacity building processes, and I want to share a good practice, and is YUNGO, the youth constituency for the UNFCCC. They already offer training to youth, open and free trainings on climate finance. So it's kind of literacy on how to understand climate finance, also the architecture, what is kind of the importance of youth action and relationship with climate finance. I know every year they have kind of climate finance kind of trainings and workshops and kind of an academy. And another aspect that I always see when we work with different communities is that it is important to understand climate finance, but other point is also inclusion, and the way that how we can make climate finance architecture more inclusive towards youth. So we know we're talking at the level of states, banks, international organizations, but how can we also ensure that that finance will reach not just vulnerable communities, but youth? So to give you an example, sometimes, working with grassroots movements and organizations, when you apply for grants, sometimes some of the eligibility, requests, they are like really out of, reach when they ask you a bunch of experience and sometimes a lot of information that perhaps youth we can provide if we are talking from a youth organization, especially from a vulnerable country. And another good practice that I would like to also share is that with the Youth Climate Justice Fund, it has been kind of a very interesting funding opportunity for youth in climate justice. So they give seed funding of around $10,000 per national project, and per regional project up to $50,000. And this is very interesting because it's managed for youth by youth. And it is giving opportunity as well to community organizations. And I know nowadays there has been more kind of microfunding projects targeting as well youth in climate action, because one thing is to know the theory, but how you're going to put that theory into practice is by also accessing to that funding, and also being able to talk with your own government and to understand where those fluxes are going. Yeah, that would be that from my side. Thank you.
Okay, so Joyce, I'll ask you another question just to carry on with our conversation around mental health, right? Studies have established a correlation between climate change and mental health. Climate change is a cross-cutting issue. One particular study of 10,000 individuals aged between 16 to 25 across 10 countries revealed alarming numbers. More than half of the subjects reported feeling sadness, anxiety, anger, and powerlessness about the climate crisis. So from your perspective as a young person and as a youth advocate, what are the ways in which this issue should be addressed?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think it's also a very personal question, because during 2019, when like the world started seeing the fires of the Amazon, my mom lives in the border of Peru and Brazil, in the Peruvian Amazon, and I remember like for us it was like we knew that was happening. I wasn't there at the moment, so it was kind of difficult because sometimes you just feel powerless not to be able to be there. But at the same time there was like a lot of news in the media, so it was like for the first time in my life I really experienced climate anxiety. And I remember back then I talked to certain professionals, and then they were trying to isolate the problem as it was a personal problem, right? Like you're having climate anxiety, it's like your problem, it's like an isolated thing, right? When I realized during that time, several of my colleagues, friends, and even people that weren't necessarily involved in climate action, they were also experimenting this consistent, like constant anxiety. So it wasn't like a personal problem. And then when you start realizing, sometimes obviously it is important to give a name to that, not just the feeling, but also kind of that overwhelming experience that most of the youth, like in climate action, or sometimes not necessarily climate action, we are experiencing. But at the same time, it's very important to recognize that that is not necessarily a personal problem, like isolating the person, but it's a global thing. Millions of people are passing through and feeling it. And also I think that it is important as well not to normalize that if you are a climate activist, then therefore you have climate anxiety, or vice versa. Again, I also think that it's very important to count with data. So there have been several cases that we have talked to certain organizations, agencies, to get the data, because how can you do public policy, especially for mental health, without data? So this is fundamental. And again, youth, they are agents for research, and we can facilitate these processes as well. And we actually have an interesting study case for UNICEF Paraguay. When I used to work with them, we used a chat box as well with WhatsApp, and we did the first national, actually with a small kind of research through a chatbot in WhatsApp, and we got the first kind of data on climate anxiety, because we were facing a lot denialism, saying, oh, that's not real, that's something from the youth, nowadays you're being very weak, you know what I'm saying? So we got actually data, and we got to show that, introducing the term of climate anxiety inside kind of different areas and different climate change oriented policies for youth. And the another aspect is, as a person, right, to recognize that that's happening, understand that sometimes not necessarily you need to overwhelm yourself with doing a bunch of things, but reconnecting as well with a community, with a space where you can, feel that you can be part and you can act. This is very important, reconnection. And also to understand that you can, do it all by your own. So collective intelligence, it is fundamental in order to mitigate, but also to reconnect yourself with a community, with your roots, and understanding that you are not alone again. And there are a lot of people, honestly, a lot of people around the world working, whether it's mitigating or adapting against climate change.
Yeah. So thank you, Joyce. You really bring a new angle to the whole conversation around climate change and how it's impacting mental health. So I'm hoping that the audience is with us on this. As I move on to Hannah. Hannah, we've talked about the climate change stresses that the youth face, but we haven't tackled how the risks that young people face can be compounded by other characteristics or identities such as gender, disability, status, refugee status, among others. Why is it important to use an intersectional lens, and what actions should be prioritized to ensure these multidimensional challenges that young people face, especially in developing countries, are addressed? This is for you, Hannah.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I just want to echo appreciation for Joyce's comments just now. I think, as unfortunately as you have been targeted as like kind of young people talking about climate anxiety, it's also so important for everyone to be having these conversations. And I just want to recognize the leadership of the folks that are bringing this forward. But then kind of broadening out to the massive collective of who makes up what we talk about when we say young people. I mean, this is every section of our global community. Youth are not a homogenous group. They cannot be treated as such. And I think there's so many different reasons why we have to break down maybe that tradition of thinking of, okay, you have the youth over here, you have gender folks over here and women over here, but it doesn't help us solve this problem. So meeting people where they are, why they're concerned about climate, why they're having anxiety, is going to be essential to bringing them into conversations and providing the right spaces. So some young people are worried about kind of the future of employment and jobs and how they're going to sustain careers or maybe just their lives in the coming years. Some are battling conflict and working through a lack of freedom in their countries. Some people are preoccupied with natural disasters and famines, and all of this context is driving their work and their need to speak on and work towards climate solutions. So with all of this context in mind, we've developed a best practice brief recently that's looking more towards kind of this inclusive and intersectional approach to NDC implementation, not necessarily targeted at young people, but it's kind of just a highlight, an overview of how countries can commit to doing this work, to building on the capacities of a diverse set of stakeholders, while also acknowledging that it's incredibly complex. It's potentially very difficult to execute. I think I saw in the chat that sometimes there's a lot of commitments made, and then when it comes to really put this in practice, it's quite challenging. But there's highlights of a few countries, including Peru, which has kind of formalized participation across a wide range of stakeholders, including indigenous peoples, in climate action through legislation. So really documenting that, formalizing that. We also looked at Burkina Faso's collaboration with the Ministry of Gender from an early stage. So making sure to bring in the experts across government, and Ecuador's work with non-state actors and women's organizations. So I'll throw this link in the chat, but just to restate what Joyce said about this work looks very different in each country, but prioritizing inclusion and equity and justice from the earliest stages will be really essential to having these NDC commitments that deliver actual transformation and social and economic change that's really needed to sustain the climate, the mitigation targets, the things that we're setting.
Right. Okay, so earlier on, Hilary talked about the fact that USAID is implementing holistic, cross-sectoral and assistance-based approaches. So I think that will work very well in the context of climate and mental health. So in the interest of time, we are really running out of time in this very important discussion. I will just ask Hilary very quickly to talk about the issue around creating green jobs, where not much attention is being paid to building the pipeline of workers and ensuring that this area is diverse. So Hilary, can you talk about what should be done so that we can build the requisite skills, capital, and networks to be agents of change in the green transition? What is USAID doing in this space? And I would like you to just take note of time. We've run out of time, so if you could be as brief as possible. Thank you.
Sure. I will hopefully be able to just tie a bit together of all the wonderful examples that we've heard from folks, just to share that USAID is taking that holistic systems-based approach and partnering with other governments, right? So I wanted to just share quickly an example of USAID's partnership in Colombia, where we sponsored really the training of 12 young indigenous women to go and work in the energy sector, the renewable energy sector in Colombia. And so they had 12 months of training. They participated in a paid internship program. And I think this is a really novel example of bringing together partnerships, thinking of historically marginalized populations, as well as thinking of that gender diversity as well in sort of breaking out of traditional gender norms when it comes to sectors like energy, waste management, some of these other areas. So I think one of the main things that USAID is doing is investing in skills development and looking at partnerships to be able to really invest in a diverse cohort of young people to really be key catalysts in the transformation of this just transition for our economies, first of all, and then also for our societies as a whole. I think Hannah said that really well. And then Joyce's personal examples really brought it to light. So thank you all so much for this space, and just appreciate the time.
Yes. So green jobs will be very important going forward into the future. So really, really excited to hear that this is being supported under USAID. So I just want to turn to you, Tim, for just one last word from you that you would like to encourage national governments, donors, private sector, as they support the work that we do, not only in your area, but in the areas that others have spoken about today.
Very much, Shivo. One thing that comes to mind is really valuing, and as Hilary said, young people in all their diversity, not as a homogenous category, as really valued stakeholders, not beneficiaries, and making sure that young people in all their diversity and all of their different experiences have a seat at the table. And I think that's you know, and that coming back to what Joyce was saying around climate anxiety, that it's a shared responsibility, you know, that saving the world doesn't rest solely on young people's shoulders. And I think it's around, you know, equipping and preparing young people and for unknown or possible futures, and thinking about how they can play really valuable roles as problem solvers to help address some of the challenges that we're facing. Thanks, Sheba.
So thank you very much. We've now sort of run out of time, and I just want to very quickly, first of all, applaud the panelists. I think they've been very, very excellent. They've been absolutely excellent. They've shared insights into a very important topic, young people, their resilience, and the importance of their voice in climate action. I think at the center of all this is what Tim has just said. We need to value our young people in all their diversities, and that young people, as Tim says, are not homogeneous. Earlier on, we also talked about the need for young people to have a seat at the table. They need to be part of the delegations that attend meetings such as the COPs. They need to be part of teams of negotiators, because the future really is about young people. We've also talked about the link between climate change and mental health. Let's take note of this. Ladies and gentlemen, it's very important that we take note of the impact that climate change and it's having on mental health. We also talked about migration, the importance of keeping an eye on the issue around mitigation, adaptation, and migration. We also said schools and communities need to be quick to prepare and also be part of first responders in countries such as Papua New Guinea and others. It is important for us to provide knowledge on disaster risk to our communities, and we also have to ensure that our infrastructure is protected, considering that it is at risk in the context of climate change. Look, at this point, let me just thank the institutions that you work for giving you the opportunity to be part of today's discussion. Let me also thank those who support CASI, so USAID, architects of CASI, Act Global, who are implementing CASI, NDC Partnership. We work with you. The work that you are doing is really, really exciting. Colleagues from Act Australia, it's good to see you, Tim, because I'm sitting in Australia right now. Wonderful. I enjoyed listening to you, Joyce, talking about your own experience as a migrant. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of what is a wonderful webinar, and this was organized to celebrate International Youth Day under the auspices of the Comprehensive Action for Climate Change Initiative, an initiative of USAID. Thank you and have a lovely day.
Thanks, everyone. Happy IYD.
Thanks, everyone.